Hi everyone, welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today we continue exploring the section on misdeeds with these few sentences to begin with. So the first misdeed is to frame others for one's offences. And the second misdeed here is to obstruct the arts of healing and divination. In fact, if we look at the very first sentence, it's actually part of a cluster of concepts that Kelly covered last week as well. So the sentences to refuse to correct one's faults, to refrain from performing good deeds, and this sentence to frame others for one's offences actually has a common misunderstanding or misdeed, which is ultimately not knowing, or actually knowing what is right, the right thing to do, and also knowing what is wrong, but actually not admitting, acknowledging it, and ultimately not doing it. In fact, when you get to this particular sentence about framing others, we do a word-by-word breakdown. It ultimately means that you implicate and involve others in one's offences. So obviously the whole purpose of this would be to try to cover up your mistakes, to cover up your wrongdoing, and shift the blame and avoid the consequences. Not only is this blatant dishonesty, but actually it doesn't really work. Because ultimately the truth is revealed, sometimes over time, sometimes it may take even years, but it ultimately is revealed, and one has to ultimately suffer the consequences. But I think more importantly, it doesn't really work because before even others find out, we ourselves suffer the consequences of our own actions because we cannot deceive ourselves. Don't know, but wonder if any one of you has ever seen a young child tell a lie. It's quite interesting, of course, because they look embarrassed when they do it. And it's because they clearly know that what they're doing is wrong. They know and they feel guilty and ashamed. Even though, of course, when we grow up, this guilt, this inner guilt, this feeling of shame never changes. And this knowledge of the fact that we are going against our conscience is always there when we do something wrong, regardless of our age. And psychologists actually have a term called cognitive dissonance, which is a sense of disharmony. So this dissonance or disharmony between what we believe, our principles, our knowledge of what is right and wrong, and what our behavior is, so what we say and do. So there's a disconnect, a inconsistency between our beliefs and our behavior, and this causes a cognitive dissonance, essentially an emotional stress, an internal state of discomfort and distress. Say it's an emotional pain that we carry around with us that actually affects negatively on our mental health. On the other hand, if our values, if our emotions and our behavior, our words and actions are in correspondence, then we experience a state of satisfaction. And this is quite clearly stated in a sentence from The Highest Learning, one of the 4 books of Confucian learning, which says that if we are sincere of our intentions, what we are thinking, if it is in accordance with the principles, the sincere intentions means to not deceive oneself, to be honest with ourselves. So what happens is that we evaluate our thoughts. Are they for our own personal self-interest, for our own personal gain, or are they for the greater good, which is in accordance with the principles? Now, if they are in accordance with the greater good, then it means that we are honest with ourselves. We're not deceiving ourselves, thinking that we can get away with doing something that is actually for our own self-interest. And what this then leads to, as it says here, is a state of inner fulfillment. Well, what does this mean? It's exactly that idea of an internal state of satisfaction. Even if no one else praises you, even if no one knows, you yourself know that you have accorded with the principles. What you're doing is right. And sometimes it is difficult. Sometimes it's difficult to apologize, to say sorry, to take the blame, to admit that it is your fault. But actually, after you do that, it's almost as if a weight comes off your shoulders. And this state of inner fulfillment, by being honest with yourself, leads to positive mental health. And later in the highest learning, in this same section, it explains that actually this is what nurtures our entire body, our mental and our physical health. So these thoughts within this idea of developing our honesty, making intention sincere, has flow-on effects to our health, and obviously, as you can imagine, to our interactions with others. So if we take a step back and think about it, all these different instructions, the guidance in the highest learning, the Confucian texts, but even the Exalted Treatise, whether it's Confucian, Taoist, or Buddhist, they all help us to develop a very important ability to evaluate our thoughts. They provide us with standards and guidelines so that we know that this is what we should be aiming towards. It helps us to develop the habit of looking within when we find something, when we find someone or something around us that's not satisfactory. It's not what we hoped for. But rather than blame others, rather than involve others, and shift the blame, we turn within and think about how it is that we can improve ourselves. So, for example, in teaching, as a teacher, if I see a student who's not improving, who's not motivated, well, it'd be most productive. The most productive thing to do is to look within, to look for the cause within myself. How is it that I'm explaining? Are they understanding? How should I change the way that I teach, or perhaps find a time to address this particular student, to encourage them in the right direction? So the way of thinking is the problems and the issues around us may be the same, but the way of addressing it is much more productive, and not only leads to an inner sort of positive mental health, but also ultimately better relations all around, our interpersonal relations. So that's the very first idea, framing others for one's offences. And the flip side of that, and what we should be aiming at, is to think and look within, to search within for the causes of the things around me. And when we're doing something wrong, to first stop ourselves and think about, evaluate, and think about admitting and acknowledging that this is something that we shouldn't do. So all of those different lines help us with develop this particular habit. The next sentence is to obstruct the arts of healing and divination. And interestingly, again, it's relating to two other lines later in the Exalted Treatise. So I've listed them all here. So it includes denouncing the wise and the sagely, intimidating the moral and virtuous. And you can see all of these different misdeeds have a common denominator, which is that of hindering and preventing others from doing good. So you might ask, what do you mean by the arts of healing and divination? Well, we look back to perhaps around the 1st century in a period in Chinese history known as the Han Dynasty. The so-called these arts were related to certain professions, certain technical professions, and I've listed them here. So people who could divine, so tell the future, using various methods, physicians, so people who helped others in terms of their health, astrologers, those who could sort of evaluate and understand the celestial sort of signs to be able to help and predict the future, but also help with government. And then the final one are the fortune from their physical features. All of these different professions ultimately, later in Chinese history, in the later Han period, became grouped with, that of Taoist masters and the kinds of methods and skills that they offered to the community and to government. But generally, as you might think of, maybe these professions are quite rare these days. But how this particular line still remains relevant is the fact that generally these so-called arts, methods and skills can refer to any profession, any kind of sort of technical skill that might benefit lives in some way. Okay, so then this really opens up the scope, doesn't it, to, or many of the professions in today's world that can be of some benefit. And so then the line is, or the misdeed then is to prevent others from going about their jobs. So because their jobs, their responsibilities, if they fulfill those responsibilities, can help others in some way. And it's very interesting in Venerable Master Ching Kung's lecture, he explains this kind of interpretation. He says that, in other words, we should enable all theories and methods that are of benefit to society and all beings to be widely promoted. So he doesn't just sort of limit it to certain professions or skills, but actually any theory, any method that could be of benefit. And then he relates this back to the Buddhist tradition. So in the Buddhist scriptures, for some of you who may have read some of these scriptures before, there's often a section at the very end of the scripture, usually the final chapter, in which it's called the section on transmission. And each of the sutras, the scriptures, will often have this. Here, Venerable Master is asking us to think of, well, what's the meaning of this? Why is it so important that every scripture will often have this section on transmission? Well, he explains that this is because of the Buddha's hope that these principles and methods could be disseminated, could be, widely promoted throughout the world. And the three, the worlds of the past, present, and future. So not just, the people that the Buddha spoke to in his times, but more importantly, thousands of years later, today, we can still benefit. And the benefit to all beings, not simply those in the human realm. So you can see here that this great mindset in which one is generous enough to promote all theories and methods, not just simply, my own opinions, my own works or my own ideas, but actually to think of how other people's ideas, theories in the past that may be of benefit, how can we promote that? Interestingly, in these lectures, Venerable Master explains how the eminent Buddhist master Yin Guang, who is celebrated as the 13th patriarch of the Pure Land School of Buddhism, that he used many of, or if not all, his donations in reprinting such sacred texts, scriptures, morality books, so that they could be widely circulated. Of course, in those days, the printing press was quite expensive, and there were no such things as digital copies, so it needed to be printed, and that would involve paper, ink, etc., time and money, and therefore Great Master Yin Guang would often use his donations for that. And in fact, Venerable Master notes that Master Yin Guang printed more of these Taoist texts, such as the Exalted Treatise and Liao Fan's 4 lessons, texts that were not necessarily, were not related to the Buddhist tradition, that he printed more of those than the Buddhist scriptures. And Venerable Master sort of reflects on why that was the case, why it was that a great Buddhist master would promote something that wasn't Buddhist, in the pure sense of Buddhism as being a Buddhist scripture. And says, well, actually wasn't about whether this was part of his tradition or others, but actually he had this great and generous mindset of thinking simply of what would benefit people in his times. And something like the Exalted Treatise that we've been exploring over these months, you can see that the sentences are very short. Each sentence provides us with something really practical, something that we can do in our lives. It's really relevant to us. And, regardless of how old you are, regardless of your profession, which country you come from, everyone can actually put it into practice. So it's much more accessible than perhaps some of the longer scriptures. So that's why Master Yin Guang was heavily promoted and advocated these texts. Venerable Master himself followed in his footsteps. These lectures that are Venerable Master's lectures that are available online, this set of lectures was actually recorded when he was in Singapore, and it was recorded when he was very busy actually lecturing on several other sutras, and he would make time, half an hour every day after breakfast, just to lecture on the Exalted Treatise, amongst his very busy schedule of important meetings and other lecture series. And yet he still took time out after every breakfast for 30 minutes to lecture on the Exalted Treatise. But we can see, of course, that Venerable Master also followed in Master Yin Guang's footsteps in his commitment to promote all sacred texts. So this idea of all theories and methods that are of benefit to society. Because the sacred texts we might call wisdom literature doesn't just exist within the Buddhist tradition, but as you can see in the Taoist tradition, Confucian tradition, and even many faiths around the world. The different texts speak to different audiences and can be beneficial to different people. So they should be promoted. We know, of course, Venerable Master has spent a lot of time promoting the various Chinese traditions and works like the Siku Quanshu, translated as the complete library of the 4 branches of literature, which is the most voluminous sort of collection of texts in Imperial China. You could say that it's the largest collection of these pre-modern texts, and it brings together various schools of thought. So we're not just talking about Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucian, but other schools and other philosophers, and trying to ensure that all of these theories and methods are preserved to future generations. So we know that Venerable Master invested a lot of time and money in ensuring that the collection, the complete library, would be donated. Like sets were reprinted and donated to major libraries and universities and educational institutions around the world, so that every part of the world can benefit. Of course, even more important than that is more important than having the physical copies preserved is having people to understand and interpret them for society today. And that's the very mission of the Academy of Sinology. So this then leads to what Venerable Master says next in the same lecture, which he says that the Buddha taught us that what he had gained in this lifetime, his enlightenment, this realizing of his innate wisdom and his innate compassion, all of that was what actually a continuation of what he had cultivated in his former lifetimes. So all of the good deeds, the merits that he had accumulated from various lifetimes. And we know that the Buddhist tradition teaches us about the law of causality, the principle in which it doesn't just simply or is limited to one lifetime, but actually transcends our lifetimes in the past, our many lifetimes in the past, the current lifetime, and even to future lifetimes. So what we do here and now has an impact beyond the 70 or the average of 70 years that we have on this earth, but actually it's important for our cultivation for our next lifetime as well, according to Buddhist principles of reincarnation. So he says that knowing this principle, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, sages and worthies, their every thought is to benefit society. So they waste no moment, don't waste any time on other thoughts, but all thoughts should be about benefiting all living beings and ensuring that these good works, these ideas, these methods are available for everyone, so that everyone can achieve honor, wisdom, health, longevity, etc. So it says every little piece of knowledge and skill they would be willing to teach and share with others in the hopes that everyone could understand and master this same level of enlightenment and the same level of great fortune. So this is the heart of the Buddha, the Bodhisattvas, the sages and worthies. So having such a mindset, having such a heart, how could they cause obstacles for others? How could they hinder others from actually promoting these great ideas, these great methods and theories and principles? Let alone, hindering someone who's actively trying to do good, who's actively trying to do their job that can contribute to society. So, as he mentions here, those who are enlightened, the sages, the worthies, those who are cultivated, they wouldn't even have the thought of preventing and hindering others, let alone doing it. And I think that sort of reading these words, if you reflect on all the different people that you interact with on a daily basis, how is it that we can help them do their work in a better way? How can, even if we can't help them, how can we encourage them with our words so that they can fulfill their responsibilities, their tasks, which can then help others? So it sort of opens up your mind to the limitless possibilities of good deeds. It's not simply about donating money. It's actually, recognizing these skills, these the knowledge, the methods, etc., that can be of benefit, and just promoting it, encouraging it. If we come back to the Exalted Treatise, we know that this particular text is only very short, just over 1,000 words. But yet, even just this one text has a great impact. I'd like to recount a story that was included in the Collectanea on the Way and its Virtue, in which tells of a scholar from Jiangnan in the 18th century. So Jiangnan at that time was a great center for publishing. And a particular scholar who heard of the Exalted Treatise wanted to make a donation, who wanted to ensure that these works could be circulated and disseminated throughout the community. So he made a donation and bought some paper and asked for a publisher to print X number of copies with the paper that he donated. Well, unfortunately, this particular printer, he had other jobs, and he stole several sheets of paper to use for other purposes. Later on, when the scholar came back to check on the progress of this publication, this print, this particular printer, all of a sudden, he knelt before the scholar and said, "Actually, I have to admit that I've done wrong. I've actually stolen the paper that you donated, some of the paper, and used it for printing other things. And as a result, there have been fewer copies of the Exalted Treatise printed, which would obviously mean that there's fewer copies that can be disseminated and circulated." He then said that, in fact, he knows that the spirits will then punish him, but he wanted to confess his wrongdoing. A few days later, this printer, in fact, passes away. And his passing, his death, is witnessed and observed by not only the scholar, but also his family and the community. You can see that's probably why it was included as a story in this book. So it's a true story. I think, when I read that, the first thing that you think of is, well, why were there such grave consequences for just stealing a few sheets of paper? Well, actually, if you think about it, from what we've explored together, what we've discussed about the Exalted Treatise, you can see that each sentence, if you even just take one sentence and you're able to practice it, then that could have a huge impact. Let's say, for example, you're a magistrate and you read the sentences and you understand the consequences of being corrupt. You then decide to start afresh and ensure fair sentencing. Then the number of people that would be influenced and affected by your decisions and your conduct would be numerous. That's just from one sentence. Let's say you're a merchant. You have a business. Through the sentences in the Exalted Treatise, you understand the importance of honest trading and the importance of providing high quality products that meet the standards. then everyone in the community that buys your products, other traders, would also be affected through your ethical practice. And so, even one sentence in the Exalted Treatise can change someone's life. And by them changing their lives, improving, they provide a model for others in the community who might emulate and be moved to emulate from their good conduct. So you can see, of course, that by not printing as many copies as he should have, the detriment, the negative consequences and the impact would be incalculable. We also have to remember that in those days, there was no internet, there were no digital copies, and in fact, some people were illiterate. So the physical copy was even more important in those days. And one physical copy would not just benefit one reader, but actually, because people were illiterate, there would be scholars who would read these texts aloud and explain them to gatherings of the public. And in this way, the teachings, the guidance could be also further disseminated. So, if that one copy was not available, then you can also imagine the number of people that, because of that lack of that one copy, would not have benefited. So from that, you can see that actually a few sheets of paper do have grave consequences. And something that we're all exploring together, the Exalted Treatise, does have this immense impact. The challenge for all of us is then to be able to put it into practice. So that's the idea of promoting, encouraging various arts and skills and methods. So it's not simply the professions of healing and divination, as it's stated here, but on a more wider scope, we can think about encouraging the good works of others. So then that naturally leads to the next two lines about denouncing the wise and sagely and intimidating the moral and virtuous. So first of all, who are the wise and the sagely? If we break down each of these words, it helps us to then think of the sentence, the full meaning of the sentence. First of all, the first word in Chinese is not just to denounce, but to make fun of, to humiliate or dishonor. The second word is particularly to slander, so through one's words. And then the wise and the sagely that we've translated here, actually from the lectures of Little Master, he sort of defines the sage as someone who fully comprehends, has thorough comprehension of the reality of the cosmos. So an understanding of life and the universe. And in Confucianism, this person would be termed a sage. In Buddhism, this person would be termed a Buddha. The next level down is the wise. So someone who partially comprehends the reality of life and the universe. And in Confucianism, this person is often, this term, xian, is translated as a worthy. In Buddhism, this person might be known as a bodhisattva, of which there are various levels. So you can see here that this is not just anyone who might be intelligent, but has a specific definition. Now, in the collected commentaries, it explains that there might be two types of people that would sort of denounce the wise and sagely. And the first type are those who are ignorant. They're ignorant of they don't know the difference between right and wrong. They are unable to recognize who is a sage or a worthy or a wise. But on top of that, they're unaware of the very grave consequences of slandering and humiliating such people. So and because of this unawareness, this ignorance, they actually commit this wrongdoing. The second type of person is someone who just wants to be unconventional, and wants to make make a splash, to cause a sensation by sort of denouncing and criticizing perfectly orthodox and sort of ethical teachings, making a spectacle of themselves, thinking that they have original insights. And oftentimes this might be because of personal gain, for one's personal reputation, to make a name for themselves. So generally, those two types of people would do this. And I guess, we have to think about and reflect on whether we might be doing this in some way, shape, or form. So on one level, the wise and the sagely here refers to the sages of the past. So they're not alive today, but their words are recorded in the sacred texts of all the different faiths. And they, in many different religions or countries, they could be termed wisdom literature or sacred texts or scriptures, classics. So it's important to respect these texts, these very important texts, whether it's a physical copy or a digital copy. And we show this respect, say, for example, but when we use the physical copy to, ensure that our hands are clean, ensure that the desk that we place it on, where we place it, the surface that we place on is also clean, that we have the appropriate attitude towards the book, and we don't use or deface parts of that physical copy. I guess that's just one level of understanding. More importantly, by respecting the instructions and the guidance in these texts, it means that we have to translate that respect into action, to put it into practice and try to think about how we can live it in our lives and really embody these teachings so that we can help preserve the legacy of these past sages, ensure that more and more people know about them through our own words and our lived example. The other idea here is that when we think about the sages, it's not just those of, the Taoist texts or the Confucian texts, but actually all the different traditions. The collected commentaries quotes from the third emperor of the last dynasty of imperial China, known as the Qing dynasty. So Emperor Yongzheng ruled for 13 years, and his reign was considered an era of peace and prosperity. In fact, his father, Emperor Kangxi, and his son, Emperor Qianlong, the three emperors, the three reigns put together, were considered a golden age in Chinese history. So here's a very famous edict or declaration in which he espouses and talks about his reverence towards all the traditions of Chinese culture. So I've taken out extracts from here, from this imperial edict, that I'd like to share with you now. So here at the beginning, he talks about the three teachings, and they refer to Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And he says that all of these teachings enlighten people throughout the nation with their principles. And all of these principles, he believed, originated from the same source, and their various paths, so their practices, can coexist without conflict. Now, you're probably thinking, why did he have to issue an imperial edict with these ideas? Well, not only did he feel very strongly and revere all the various sages, but also because at that time, people were saying maybe Confucianism or other certain traditions were better than others. Confucianism, we know, was actually something that everyone in China, as a literate person, had to learn. They had to memorize the Confucian texts to be able to pass the imperial state exams, to become a government official, to become part of government. But yet here, Emperor Yongzheng explains that all the teachings are important and very clearly states that they come from the same source. So despite the fact that they have different forms, different customs, different practices, obviously on an academic level, the jargon, the specialist terms are very different. There are different schools, etc. But the underlying ethical principles have this shared commonality. Explains that in their view of cherishing life, so all of these three teachings cherish life and denounce killing of life. And they share this idea of benevolence. So that's the idea of humanity or benevolence. They also espouse caring for others as oneself and to be selfless. They also teach about disciplining oneself in terms of our anger, our emotions, restraining greed, prohibiting misdeeds, preventing the improper, and the importance of cultivating our character. So this, through his words, he recognizes the fact that their ethical values and their principles and practices promote the betterment of the human spirit, promote the betterment of society and our interpersonal relations. He even mentions that Buddhist teachings can be used to cultivate the mind, Taoist teachings to regulate the body, and Confucian teachings to govern the world. So he noted that all of these traditions have various strengths, and they can be used and applied in different aspects of life. In fact, they can be used throughout our lives, at any age, in any profession. That all people, regardless of their social status, can benefit, and they can be used for different audiences. So he notes very clearly that they are all beneficial. And ultimately, he concludes with this, that it's not just the Chinese traditions. He says a sage may be born in China, in the West. They may not even be part of the Han ethnicity. They could be born in other territories, but they live in different places. But their realization of the truth is like the matching of seals. In other words, they have similar teachings, guidance, and these shared values, shared principles of uplifting the human spirit, of creating a better world. And all of these, therefore, deserve to be treasured, to be valued and preserved in society, to be taught and advocated. So when I read this, I think about how this was his ideas in the 18th century, but it's still very much important to us today, that the texts of various traditions, well, they may seem ancient, but they're certainly not outdated or irrelevant. And there has been an increasing trend in sinology, so the study of ancient China, in the last few decades, to translate these various texts, but not just simply translating the original text, but actually translating or interpreting these texts and the principles for a modern audience. So there's this increasing realization that the ideas are important to people today and are relevant and can be of benefit. So these texts, of course, they contain the words and the teachings and guidance of past sages, but we need people today to really try to understand them, to ensure that this legacy continues, to preserve it for generations to come. And in fact, Confucius, the Buddha, lived over 2,000 years ago. And if it were not for many generations of scholars who continued to learn and to live the teachings, may have been lost today. So the idea then here is it's not just about thinking about the past sages, but also to be respectful to people who today who are learning and living and cultivating the sage teachings, which then brings us to the next point, that it's about the past sages, but also present sages and those who are moral and virtuous. So those who are moral and virtuous refers to those who you recognize to be of virtue, but also those who are cultivating their virtue. So people are not 100% perfect, but the fact is that they're trying to improve, they're trying to cultivate, and that in itself deserves our respect. So therefore, we should encourage them, we should help them, as opposed to intimidate them, which in this case is specifically a misdeed. Now, when we listen to Venerable Master's lectures on the Exalted Treatise, he takes it one step further. In fact, he tells us that, and he challenges us, that who are the moral and virtuous? In fact, we should think about the moral and virtuous as being everyone around us. How? So he says in these extracts that we should reflect on ourselves. Every one of us has faults. So, and thinking that we don't have faults is in fact the biggest fault, the greatest mistake. Even one of the highest levels of bodhisattvas, called virtually enlightened bodhisattvas, are continuing to recognize their faults on a daily basis so that they can continue to correct themselves, so that they can reach Buddhahood or the highest level of enlightenment. So if these virtually enlightened bodhisattvas are doing this on a daily basis, then how can we compare? We should be doing the same. He continues by saying that we have to discover our faults every day as part of our making progress on our own cultivation. How do we do this? Two methods he sets out here. The first is to read the scriptures, these sacred texts, whether it's Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist, or of other faiths, and use their teachings, the teachings of the sages and worthies of the past, to reflect and evaluate ourselves, check ourselves. Am I doing the same? Do I think the same things? Would I say those things? And why is it that I wouldn't? What's the difference? How can I emulate them? How can I be more like them? That's the first method. The second is, well, obviously we don't have 100% of our time. We can't necessarily devote it to simply reading the scriptures, in all our waking hours. Most of us have work to do. In which case, when we are in the company of others, when we interact with others on a daily basis, we observe others. Most of the time, we might notice their strengths, but also their faults. The point here is that when we observe their faults, not to blame them, but to reflect on ourselves and think about whether we ourselves have the same fault. He continues by saying that we shouldn't disparage others or criticize them. So if we've seen that they have this fault, then we take that opportunity to use it to reflect on ourselves, to correct ourselves urgently if we have that fault, and if we don't have that fault, to encourage ourselves to avoid it, to prevent it, in other words. And therefore, what is there to criticize? The person who we see with all these faults, with these weaknesses, actually that person is our teacher. They've taught us the importance of avoiding these faults through their manifestation, through their example. Even though it's a negative example, we've learned perhaps some of the consequences. The first consequence being that you evoke a sense of frustration in others. So we don't want that. We don't want to do the same for others. We don't want to cause frustration for others. So therefore, we know that this is a negative example. We should try to avoid it ourselves. So without their example, we wouldn't be able to discover our own faults, and we would also not be able to avoid and understand the consequences of those faults. So Venerable Master explains that in his view, these people are good friends and good teachers, virtuous teachers that are helping us to reflect on our own virtue and improve ourselves. And therefore, because they've helped us improve, we cannot criticize or look down on them. So Venerable Master challenges us to see everyone around us as sages, as worthies, as Buddhas, as Bodhisattvas, as people who are helping us progress, whether it's through their positive example or through their negative example. And we know the standards because we read, we have to, use the texts so that we keep reminding ourselves of what is a negative example, what is a positive example, what to avoid, what to learn from, and how to really emulate the goodness and bring out the goodness in ourselves. And so when you think about it, it actually makes cultivation so much more easier that, regardless of what environment we find ourselves in, regardless of the situation we're in, we can cultivate and we can continually improve. We don't have to be in some sort of, mountain retreat to be able to cultivate. We can cultivate in our daily lives. The important thing is that we have the standards. We reflect using texts like the Exalted Treatise, scriptures, sacred texts, etc. We may have to give ourselves some time during the week to look at these texts so that we know what are the clear sort of guidelines. But the rest of the time, we're actually always learning as well in the people that we encounter on a daily basis, on a moment-to-moment basis. We can continue to improve. So all of these various sentences that we've covered today, yes, they might seem quite negative because they are telling us misdeeds and that we have to avoid. But ultimately, it's when we think of it on the opposite, which is how to actually do good deeds, you realize that it opens up the scope, that there's so much out there that we can do to accumulate merits to help us be better people. And on top of that, the wise and the sagely are actually amongst us. We just need to open our eyes and look at things from a different perspective. And therefore, wherever we are, in whatever moment we find ourselves in, we can constantly improve. We can constantly learn and better our lives and ultimately benefit those around us. So I leave you with that thought. Thank you again very much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.